We envision a movement.
We envision a movement.
We envision a movement of God's people.
A movement of God's people.
God's people who choose daily.
Who choose daily to promote healing
in marginalized communities in the name of Jesus.
In the name of Jesus.
In the name of Jesus.
So, Jerry, I really appreciate you making time to do this today.
No problem. It's my pleasure.
Well, it's been a long time since you and I talked, and you've been really important in my life. And Jerry Stromberg was the executive director for CCHF before I was, and Jerry, I think this is an important interview because CCHF is growing rapidly right now. We are seeing just a surprising number of young people that are kind of raising their hand and saying, "Hey, that's what I want to do with my medical career, and I want to serve Christ in this way." And as we're growing and growing rapidly, I just think it's important to understand your history in order to fully embrace your future. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for us to remember none of us were the first at anything. We walk in the footsteps of people who pioneered, and God may put the same spirit in us as He had in them. But when we recognize that, suddenly that gives you a real sense of destiny in a really powerful way. You understand that because I know you're going through right now, looking up things about your relatives from 100 years ago, or
yeah. It's exciting to me, but my grandfather was kind of a hero, and my mom was writing a book, and so she didn't quite finish it, and I finished it, and it's been a fun experience.
Well, Jerry, you've had such a rich life. You've taught at a medical school. You worked for years with the WHO. You've been all over the world doing things. If I remember right, you're an honorary chief of a tribe in Ghana somewhere.
That's right. Well, I know. Tribe, it's a community. Dotuba.
Yeah.
Yes, and I am, in fact, the Krontahini of Dotuba.
That's something.
Yes.
You've worked in Christian clinics, and then you ran CCHF for a number of years. You're a historian, you're a researcher, you're an activist. I've just so admired the way that you've lived your life and how fruitful it's been. The first thing I want to ask, you've done all these things and been involved in all these different areas, and it's not out of a sense of I can't figure out what I want to do with my life. You've been very, very deliberate about it all. What is it about CCHF that you think makes this community special?
Oh boy. I think the thing that has been so valuable to me is that as a group, they are very, very dedicated people. Most certainly of the leadership of the clinics and so forth. The special thing is they just have a real clear desire to follow God, and they're very dedicated in what they do, and they're very generous about sharing that. So that's the secret to me of what helped, at least while I was responsible for part of that work, was that if you asked anybody, if you said, I've got a guy that I met that's in Wichita, Kansas, and they're talking about starting, and it seems like it got a lot of elements that are similar to yours over there in Cincinnati or San Diego or Seattle or wherever it is. Do you suppose that you could share some of your wisdom with them? No problem at all, which led to phone calls and then to visits. And then, one of the common things that happened is that a bunch of people would say they have a vision for starting a health center, and they don't really know what to do except that they just feel like that's what God has called them to do. And what should they do? Do you have to have a doctor, one thing or another thing? And you just kind of put people together who seem to have something to share with that group, and then they would go there and visit. Mm-hmm. And that was a big part of what CCHF was involved with doing. And actually, before I was with CCHF, that's what I did here at Lawndale. People would come from wherever it was, and they'd say, we hear that this is a very special place, and can you show us around? Well, showing people around in terms of the physical setting and all that kind of stuff, that's one thing. But they needed to talk to Art Jones or Bruce Miller or some of the other physicians, and that was the key thing, to put them together that way. And a lot of those things are friendships that, as far as I know, have continued to today.
Yeah, I became their executive director / CEO. It's almost 17 years ago now, and the amazing thing is that this is a almost 45-year-old organization, and the people who were engaged in the beginning are still engaged. They're still active in the work at some level, and we're starting to lose some of them. Some of them are going home.
I was going to say those that are still with us.
Yeah, but most of them still are, and it's been amazing to me to get to know some of these folks who have been doing what most people would, from the outside, would look at and say, gosh, that's really hard, to work with that group of people, to work in that kind of setting. That is really, really hard, and they've been doing it for 40 years. There's a lot of CCHF people who have been doing it for 40 years. That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, most doctors don't practice medicine for 40 years, and they're not doing it because they're trapped. They're doing it because they love it.
Yeah, and that's that special quality. It really is. Yeah.
I'm assuming there's a lot of your story I don't know, but I'm assuming that you got involved with CCHF through Lawndale. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so how
I was working at Bethel New Life as the health director there, and I got introduced to Art in Lawndale, but I don't remember how, but I remember that it was Catherine Miller, Bruce's wife, that invited me to be on the board, and I was still at Bethel New Life when that happened.
What is Bethel New Life? Was that a church or?
Well, it's a Lutheran church, and there was a pastor whose sister was Mary Nelson, and she's a big person in Christian work, and she started something called Bethel New Life, which had all kinds of social outreach things, and one of them was a health center. And I had come on a sabbatical from the University of Colorado because I'd met her someplace, and we'd set it up, and I would spend a few months there at Bethel New Life. And I got there it was a Tuesday morning, and she invited me into her office, and the vice president was there, and they said, our health center is broke, fix it. And I knew nothing about answering that question. I mean, what do you do? So I had to learn on the fly, and Lawndale was a part of me. I mean, Art was extremely generous, but he also talked about, you ought to see Jerry Humanos or this or that and so forth. So a lot of it was just learning on the fly. But Lawndale took me in, and Art wanted somebody to take somebody else's place, and so I became his administrator. And that was when I started with Lawndale, and then I got involved with CCHF, and then I was on the board of CCHF, and then at a certain point, David Case was stepping down, and I became the new executive director.
Yeah. And how long, what, do you remember what year that was?
I'm going to say 96, but I'm not sure.
Mid-90s, sometime in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
And how long were you I started in 2007, and I know that there was another guy that was Bruce Jackson.
Jackson was here, yeah.
That helped with the big grant. But so when you took, what did CCHF look like when you stepped in? I mean, it looks very different now than it did then. But I think that our values, we've tried to be faithful to our values and our mission. But
yeah. Well, I would say because it wasn't so incredibly much involved with clinics, health centers, federally funded, so forth and so on. It was mostly a doc or two that were providing quality health care, sometimes free, sometimes not free, but it was just a little clinic. And the big thing that CCHF addressed was the whole thing about why do you do this? What keeps you going? What sustains you in the middle of all this kind of stuff? And people appreciated going to conferences where they could talk with other people who were doing the same kind of thing. We had a publication called Health and Development, and David Case was an editor, and he really embraced that role of publishing stuff that was, people's stories, people wrestling with this issue or that. But that was a very big part of it. And it was not, how do you run a federally funded health center? Because there were only a couple that were federally funded at that time.
Yeah.
And it looked like, what did it look like? We had conferences. They were pretty small. I mean, it would be a big thing if we got 100 people to come to a conference. We had the publication. And then there were, people got married to each other. There were all kinds of things like that. It was really, that happened, yeah.
It was a growing community. It was, how did people, Christians have always been involved in healthcare, and caring for the sick was a big part of Jesus's ministry. It was a big, the disciples continued that. Some people would look back to the earliest hospitals as being the outgrowth of Christian ministry back in the, maybe 3rd and 4th centuries. And so Christians have always been involved in healthcare, but something changed here in the U.S. The way that I sort of track it is that that healthcare was largely general practice until the World Wars, and it was really after that that specialists and specialties began to develop, and as that happened. Back in the general practice days, you took care of everybody. You took care of everybody in the community, and there were people who had money and they could pay you. There were people who had a chicken that they would trade you for, your services or whatever. As all that developed, as medicine developed into what it is today, there were a lot of people that got left out. There were barriers to care. They couldn't afford it. They couldn't get. Access was a problem. Affordability was a problem. And then in the mid-'60s, they started Medicare and Medicaid. And I think CCHF sprang out of a response, in my opinion, is what it looks like. How far off am I from this? That it was like, okay, the government's doing this, but like this should be like Christians should be engaged in caring for the poor and caring for people that are on the margins of society. This is who Jesus directed us towards, and it was really if Medicaid and Medicare started in the '60s, it was in the '70s that you saw people like Peter Bolins and J.D. Miller was a young guy during that time, and a number of other people, Janelle Getchis in the mid to late 70s began to
Yeah,
do
you
some
know,
things.
the people you're mentioning, let me just take back a little bit. So when I started, David Case was the executive director, and because he and his wife had an understanding that now the next move that we make will be yours, and that would be his wife, and they were going to go to California where she was going to get chaplain training, that kind of stuff. So he was no longer going to be able to be in Philadelphia, which is where the headquarters was. And
Yeah, they
so
went to-
when I became the executive director, I was in Chicago, so I was going to be in Chicago. But I went and I spent a week living with them in Philadelphia, where every day David and I sat and he tried to get me to understand the books and understand this and that. But one of the big things was, how am I going to learn what this is about? And he suggested that I make a tour and I go to a number of places, and he was happy to suggest some places. So you're talking about J.D. Miller in Everts, Kentucky, and David Bosher in
Well, at that time he was either
Jellicoe, Tennessee.
Yeah, Jellicoe,
Janelle Getchus at Christ
Christ House,
and
in the Columbia Road area,
Columbia
the
Road Health Center.
Adams Morgan neighborhood
Right,
in
right.
Washington, D.C.
right. And sitting and talking to these people, and that was just mind-blowing for me.
Me too.
And the thing that was, special about it is these people were all thinkers, but they were all thinking outside the box. So they would see what the problem was, but they could see more about what the problem was than, normal person. So JD, for example, they were doing some kind of mining, and the kind of mining that they were doing there,
He was in eastern Kentucky.
was cutting through the water sources. And so the problems that they were seeing in the health clinic had to do with what the mining companies were doing about cutting the water supply. And that's where JD, addressed his energies. Or Art Jones, I don't know, have you ever read a book called Mama Might Be Better Off Dead?
No, I'm not.
It was about this Lawndale community.
Really?
And the woman, it was at the time when Hillary was trying to get something started, and somebody had suggested that she get down to the real basic stuff that goes on in poor communities. And so she discovered Art Jones and what Art was doing. And what it was about was all the barriers to healthcare.
Yeah.
And it wasn't clinical medicine that was the problem. It was stuff like, how do you get this aunt who can hardly mobile, how do you get her over to Mount Sinai Hospital? How do you negotiate that stuff? And that's the kind of thing that Art addressed. It wasn't just making sure that you had the right instruments and stuff like that in your exam room, but how do you make all this stuff work? And that's what these people did, and that's what impressed me. Yeah.
They did it out of personal relationships with their patients. Like they came to, it wasn't that they became aware of a social issue. It's that they knew people that were trapped in that. And I was with David Case yesterday, and it was amazing to me. He hasn't been involved with this kind of thing for many years. But he just had story after story after story of people that just encountered incredible barriers to care, and that the healthcare system wasn't serving well.
Right. For the sake of adding a little bit more, so in my WHO days, I did spend a fair amount of time in Ghana, and I had one of these kinds of really aha experiences that when we were going to start a project in the Brong-Ahafo region, the government just, there were 5 of us that were on a kind of a fact-finding tour. And there were 4 doctors and me, physicians and me. And we went to Kumasi, which is the inland capital, the old traditional capital of the Ashanti Kingdom. And this doctor, who was the regional medical officer, took us around to see stuff. And Ghana had been a British colony. So before they got their independence in 1960, the Brits had been there and they had built stuff. So we got to see a community latrine.
Oh.
Now, this was not a matter of 20 one-holers in a row. This was a brick latrine that was maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, something like that. And all the people in the community, and they had half for the women and half for the men. But when I saw it, Steve, this isn't nice, but I realized everybody had diarrhea.
Yeah.
Everybody had diarrhea. And it was like, wow. And it was an eye-opening experience. But this doctor had also the wisdom to want to show us something like that. And it's for me an experience, a life of being exposed to people who think outside the box.
Yeah.
And that's really important.
I think that's exactly what we're not looking in people's latrines, but I think we
but
have
like
to.
That.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, we have to ask why. I remember a few years ago talking to Bruce Miller, and they started we were talking about risk stratification of your patients, and I'm going to get this story wrong, but it'll at least be entertaining. but we were talking about managed care contracts and how insurance companies who've never met any of the patients, who've never visited any of these communities where their people live, insurance companies were sending down kind of what the protocols were, what their expectations were. They're defining quality. They're defining what the doctors need to be doing. And I think, if I remember right, Lawndale contacted one of the big managed care companies that they were, one of the big insurance payers that they were doing managed care for, and said, hey, we live here. We know these patients. We see them every day. We think we know a better way to think about them than you do, and we think we know how to treat them better than you do, and you should let us define this. And they kind of did to some degree. And one of the things that they did was they took some of the money that they were getting paid for patient care, and they bought buses, small buses, and they hired drivers to go pick some of the people up that had transportation issues. And as they began to sort of stratify their patient population into high risk, moderate risk, low risk patients, the input that they were getting, they found that perhaps the most valuable input that they got was from the driver who had to walk up the 3 flights of steps to get to the old lady's, the grandmother's house and help her down to get into the bus, and got to go in and see who was living there and the conditions that she was living in and all of those kinds of things. And it gave them a greater understanding, and it helped them tailor care towards that person that wasn't always medical.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, just to take off from the latrine problem.
Yeah.
So you realize what these people need is getting out of poverty.
Yes.
I mean, it's not about medical interventions that's going to make the difference. And that means what you're talking about is a political problem. It turned me around. I mean, the Tanzanians said, what we're concerned about is we'll share a fair share of what little we have. And so much of what healthcare is about realizing that it's the social conditions, the poor, the poverty, and all the stuff that goes with that really has the impact on health status, healthcare.
Yeah. So you've mentioned Art Jones, who was the founding physician at Lawndale, and Janelle Getchis, who is still very active, caring for unhoused people in Washington, D.C., in her 80s now, battling some really serious health issues herself, but sees patients virtually every day. J.D. Miller, who passed away, but who lived his entire life, his entire medical life in very rural, deep Appalachia in eastern Kentucky, taught at the University of Kentucky, taught medicine at the University of Kentucky, but stayed very engaged until last summer when he went on to be with the Lord. But
Everts, Kentucky.
Everts, yeah. And who were others that you, back when you were in CCHF, that you thought were thought leaders and people who were doing something really unique?
I think people like Myron Glick in Buffalo, because he was dealing with stuff. They had a contract to deal with refugees, and so he saw what the issues were for the refugees, which were not just medical. So they started a language program to, and stuff like that, where people said, well, what do these people really need? Myron was somebody like that. I don't know. I could make a list, I'm sure.
Well, you did make a list 17 years ago when I took over. It was about 8 pages long.
Is that right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it was all these people. You were like, these are important people. These are significant stakeholders in the CCHF world. And honestly, I can't remember everybody that was on the list, but Carolyn Klaus, for example, Carolyn and Ron Klaus in Philadelphia, who started Esperanza. Of course, the folks down in Memphis, my headquarters have been down there for as long as I've been with CCHF, but Rick Donlin and Burt Waller and the doctors that were with Rick that were part of that were some of those. The work in Detroit, Covenant Community Care, that's been through some iterations, but it's still up and going and very stable, good ministry.
Well, the folks at Jellicoe, Tennessee, where Dave Boschert was, and also David McRae, who was the director there, those were people who were very, very forward-thinking and broad-thinking. And there were women, like Janelle, Carolyn Klaus, trying to think. In Pittsburgh, there were some really good people, too.
Dave Hall in Pittsburgh, and So there's a number of places that have been going for a long, long time, and mostly people who have just been serving under the radar in a lot of ways. They haven't been about trying to make a name for themselves or anything, but they have incredible fruit for it, both in their communities in terms of health outcomes, but also just in terms of their testimony for Christ in those places.
Yeah, I'm thinking about David Lawrenson, what was his first name, down at Phoenix?
David Lawrenson, not David, Paul Lawrenson,
They did some really exciting things, like they taught doctors how to give an assessment that would include spiritual things also. And in teaching them how to do that, from what I understand, some of the doctors became Christians because they were invited into that secret, that holy, intimate place.
Yeah. Paul's been a board member for CCHF until recently, and they're celebrating, I think it's either their 25th or 30th anniversary, but but they have been so responsible for not only for engaging their patients in a loving and responsible, faithful way with the gospel, but they've also, like you said, taught so many doctors to do that. And actually, like Lawndale has used a lot of the materials that the guys in Phoenix developed to do the same thing here. I know the folks in Memphis and some of the folks in other places around the country have used a lot of their resources. So,
Yeah, that it touches on one of the fairly common issues or topics for CCHF providers, and that is about how do you essentially share the gospel? How do you share your faith? How do you connect what you're doing with your Christian faith? And, that can be a touchy kind of a thing because, for example, the feds say you can't proselytize.
right.
I could talk about this for a long time, but I had experiences with people like Jerry Umanos, who was a pediatrician at Lawndale, and I said, Jerry, how do you do this? And he said, I start by praying at the first visit that we have. He said, I want to share that this is a place where if you see a provider here, they're going to ask you if you mind that they pray with you. And he said, I do it at the first visit because there's nothing that's happening then that would cause the mom that brought the child to worry. He wants to pray. What's wrong with my child? Why is he asking to pray? He said, we start right at the beginning. Then, he said later on, when there is something, he said, we've already laid the groundwork for that, so that's not an issue. Stuff like that. That's, people are creative, and then we share it with other people.
Yeah. And patients love it, actually. I think it should always be done with permission, but it's going to be rare that a patient's going to say, no, I'm uncomfortable with that. And not because they're intimidated by the doctor. There have been studies that show that patients they actually trust their doctor more than they trust a pastor. And they appreciate the doctor. Patients inherently understand that spiritual health and physical health are connected, even if they don't think of themselves as being religious. There have been studies done by Johns Hopkins and the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Hopkins, and Duke University, George Washington University. They've all done these studies that show the value of integrating spiritual care with
and Farr Curlin,
with medicine.
He did some of that work too.
Yeah, Farr had some very significant things that he's done, and what they're doing at Duke right now is pretty exciting. He and Harold Koenig and the team of people that they have there are really exploring the value of integrated spiritual care in medicine. So,
we had Harold Koenig come and speak at a workshop here, just down the street.
I haven't been able to get him to speak at one of my conferences, so you just one-upped me a little bit.
No.
That was good, though.
And he had one of my favorite jokes. He said there was this couple, and they were getting a little bit older and being forgetful and so forth and so on. And they decided they should do something about it. They went to the doc, and the doc, he knew what was going on, but he said, okay, so what I suggest you do is you each get a pad of paper, and any time something comes up that's really important that you remember, you write it down on a pad of paper. They said, okay. So they went away, and they seemed to be doing pretty well. And so one night they were just getting ready to go to bed, and the wife said, oh, you know what? I'd really like something. Do you think you could do that for me? And he said, sure, of course. She said, well, I'd like an ice cream sundae, and I'd like vanilla ice cream, and I'd like chocolate. Honey, you really should be writing this down. Chocolate sauce, and And he said, I got it, no problem. She said, okay, and then a cherry on top. Now, please write that down. He said, no, I got it. So he goes downstairs, and she's upstairs, and she hears him banging around down there, and after a while she says, well, he's got to be ready. So she goes downstairs, and there on the kitchen table is a big plate, and it's got scrambled eggs and a ham and some bacon. And she says, honey, I told you to write it down. Now look, you forgot the toast. Sorry. I love jokes.
That's good. Jerry, you've done so many different things, and you've lived such a great life. When you think back on your life, what are the things that you're the most proud of?
I think really, if I were serious about answering that question, it's the time that I had, both at Lawndale, but especially at CCHF. I had a feeling when I looked back at it that there were so many ways in which I could say that experience when I was teaching at Washington University, or that experience at WHO, or at the University of Colorado Medical School, that contributed this gift or this skill or this whatever it is to what I was called upon to do at CCHF. I was not some sort of brilliant, way out in front leader kind of thing. I was somebody that I was a facilitator. I was the one that got people together so that something could get done. And that's what I felt was probably the greatest thing that I ever did.
You did a great job at that. When I first came on, I remember you again and again and again saying to me, this is an important organization. This is a historic organization. Don't lose these articles, the H&D articles, because these have historic significance. And I remember just down the road from here, we're at Lawndale right now, but just down the road from here, going in the old CCHF offices and going up in that attic area and all those dusty boxes. And I'm thinking, I wonder how many of these I can throw away. And you're thinking, no, none of them. This is all really important. And then just the emphasis that you shared, just the incredible dignity that you, and honor that you gave the people that were really that were, waist deep in the weeds in their communities, doing things that don't get a lot of praise from maybe the medical community, but that really make a lasting impression on people who are used to being ignored, used to being dismissed. I appreciated that, and for 16 years plus, I've led CCHF, and I've told you this before, but it's the honest to goodness truth. There's rarely a day that goes by that I don't think, I wonder how Jerry would feel about this.
Well,
because
you've been very kind, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, is there anything you want to share as we close this out, or something that you wish we'd talked about?
Well, that experience in Ghana was kind of life-changing for me, because up to that time, my faith had been in one silo and my work had been in another silo. But it was so clear to me that if I were really serious about improving the health of a population, that poverty was so central to that. And poverty isn't a medical topic, essentially. I mean, a lot of doctors see that as being important to them, and that's unique to CCHF. But a lot of doctors don't. And it's those doctors and those healthcare people who see that recognize that to change things, you have to change the system. And that's something that some people just don't want to get into. And I feel like it's really essential that if Christian people who want to get involved in healthcare want to really be serious about it, they realize that changing the system, which is political, is pretty critical.
It is political, but it's also gospel.
Yes.
It's definitely gospel.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people who think of the gospel as only being about my personal sin issues and the problems that creates for me, that the gospel certainly addresses that, but that's not where it stops. And you can't read the Old or New Testament and not see that the gospel, that where Christ's death was not, that where sin did abound, grace did much more abound, that Christ's death was not only sufficient for my sin, but for its consequences. So
you preach it and I'll turn the pages.
There you go. Yeah, so, the gospel addresses my marriage. It addresses my family. It addresses my role in my community. And it's a gospel of hope. It's a gospel that's good news for the poor, and recovery of sight for the blind, and release for the captives, and the acceptable year of the Lord. So one of my favorite pictures of you is of you holding a sign saying, "Poverty is not a family value." Do you remember that?
No, where was that?
I don't know, but we'll post it when we post this. Okay. But poverty is not a family value, and it's not a gospel value either.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Well, listen, Jerry, thank you so much for, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for the encouragement that you've been to me over the years. Thank you very much for the foundation that I've had the honor of building on, that you laid, you and David Kays and others have laid in CCHF over the years. And I hope that you get an opportunity to get a sort of a view from the mountaintop, and get a chance to see just, the seeds of your faithfulness that are sprouting and growing, as this movement continues to grow and grow rapidly.
Thanks. You're very kind. And back at you, by the way.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much.